On the imperial planet of Xerexia, Princess Valessa sat on her grand throne, her cold violet eyes scanning the hall. Around her, noblemen, warriors, and diplomats from various alien races waited eagerly, hoping for her attention. They all had one desire: to claim the princess as their bondmate. Valessa, however, was unimpressed. For years, she had rejected every suitor. No male, not even the strongest warriors of her kind, had ever met her impossible standards. Some called her flawless, untouchable, a ruler who needed no equal. Others whispered that she was simply too proud to accept anyone. As another noble finished his speech, begging for a chance to prove himself, Valessa sighed and waved him away. Boring, she muttered under her breath. Her advisors exchanged nervous glances. The rejection of so many powerful figures was creating tension in the empire. If she did not choose a mate soon, war could break out between noble houses, each wanting to claim the throne through her. Before the next suitor could step forward, the hall doors swung open with a loud clang. A human entered. He was nothing like the others. No shining armor, no decorative robes. He wore a simple dark jacket and military boots, his posture relaxed yet confident. His golden brown eyes studied the grand hall with curiosity, completely unaffected by the intimidating alien nobility around him. The room fell silent. A human. Here. Valessa's lips curled into a smirk. How amusing. The advisors murmured among themselves, shocked by the human's boldness. He wasn't a prince, nor a noble. He was simply Daniel Harker, a strategist from Earth, sent as part of a diplomatic mission. His arrival had been announced earlier, but no one had expected him to actually walk into the royal court like he belonged there. Ah, the human. Valessa's voice dripped with amusement. You must be lost. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. Not at all. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The nobles gasped. No one spoke to the princess so casually. Valessa raised an eyebrow. You speak as if this court is a joke. Daniel shrugged. When a room full of warriors is begging for one woman's attention, it kind of looks like one. Silence. Then, a low growl came from one of the rejected suitors. Insulting the princess was a crime. Valessa, however, did not look angry. If anything, she looked interested. For the first time in a long while, someone was not afraid of her. Someone had dared to challenge her authority, even without meaning to. Perhaps this human was more entertaining than she thought. But he would soon learn she was not one to be challenged lightly. The court was silent. The tension in the air was thick, as if the whole room had stopped breathing. Princess Valessa stared at the human, Daniel Harker, her violet eyes sharp with curiosity. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever dared to call the royal court a joke. Around them, the nobles were furious. A Xerathian warrior, twice the size of Daniel, stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade. This human insults our princess, the warrior growled. He must be punished. Daniel didn't move. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if unimpressed by the alien size. Valessa held up a hand. No, she said, her voice calm but firm. I am not so easily insulted. The warrior hesitated, then stepped back, though his glare at Daniel did not disappear. Valessa leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand. Tell me, human, she said with a smirk, do you think yourself better than the warriors here? Daniel shook his head. Not better, he said, just different. The princess tilted her head, intrigued. And do you think you are worthy to stand in my court? Daniel met her gaze without fear. You tell me. You haven't asked me to leave yet. The nobles muttered angrily, shocked by his boldness. Yet Valessa laughed, a soft, amused sound, as if she had just found a rare, unexpected challenge. Very well, she said. Let's put your confidence to the test. She stood up, the long train of her shimmering robe flowing behind her. Her presence alone commanded attention, but there was something dangerous in her gaze now. I challenge you, human, Valessa declared, her voice echoing through the hall. A test of strength and strategy. If you fail, you will kneel before me and admit your place. Daniel crossed his arms. And if I win? The court gasped. The idea that a human could even dream of winning against the princess was absurd. Valessa smirked. If you win, I'll grant you a favor, anything within reason. Daniel pretended to think for a moment before smirking back. Sounds fair. The princess's eyes gleamed. She hadn't expected him to accept so easily. Good, she said. Then we begin. The guard stepped forward, clearing the center of the hall. The challenge was set. As Daniel removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, Valessa watched him closely. There was something different about this human. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't desperate for her approval. And for the first time, she wondered if she had underestimated him. The grand hall fell silent as the challenge was about to begin. Nobles and warriors gathered around, their eyes locked on the impossible sight. A human standing against the royal princess of Xerexia. Princess Valessa stood tall, her regal robe flowing as she stepped into the center. Across from her, Daniel Harker cracked his knuckles, his face calm. Unlike the alien warriors who flexed their muscles to intimidate, Daniel looked relaxed, almost amused. The challenge was simple, a test of strength, reflexes, and strategy. The first to force the other to yield would be declared the winner. Valessa smirked. Are you ready, human? Daniel shrugged. Are you? The court gasped at his lack of respect, but before anyone could react, Valessa attacked. She was fast, faster than any human should be able to see. Her movements were fluid, like a predator striking its prey. In the blink of an eye, she was behind him, aiming to pin him down. But Daniel moved. At the last second, he ducked, twisting away just in time. Valessa's eyes widened slightly. Not many could react to her speed. Interesting. She attacked again, this time aiming for his arm, intending to bring him to his knees. But Daniel dodged once more, slipping out of reach like he had been expecting her move. The nobles murmured in shock. This was not how it was supposed to go. Valessa narrowed her eyes. He's reading my movements. Fine. If skill wasn't enough, she would use power. With a burst of speed, she lunged, grabbing his wrist. Before he could react, she twisted, throwing him across the floor. The crowd cheered, expecting the fight to be over. But then, Daniel rolled, recovered, and stood up. He dusted himself off, giving Valessa a smirk. That all you got? Her heart skipped a beat. Something about his tone, his confidence, sent a strange thrill through her. No one had ever stood back up so easily. Valessa rushed him again, but this time, Daniel reacted before she could strike. He stepped into her attack, grabbing her wrist mid-motion. She gasped. He had trapped her. Before she could break free, he spun her momentum against her, twisting her arm just enough to force her balance off. Then, in a single movement, he flipped her onto her back. The court froze. For the first time in her life, Princess Valessa had been defeated. Daniel knelt beside her, smirking. Yield. Valessa's heart pounded. She had lost. But instead of anger, a strange excitement burned in her veins. This human was different. And now she wanted to know why. The hall was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Princess Valessa lay on the grand marble floor, her breath uneven, her mind racing. She had been defeated. A human, a mere human, had bested her in front of the entire royal court. She had never lost before. Not in combat, not in strategy, not in anything. And yet Daniel Harker stood over her, his golden brown eyes calm, as if winning against an alien princess was just another normal day for him. He extended a hand to help her up. Valessa's pride burned. She ignored his hand and rose on her own, her violet eyes locked onto his. The nobles were shocked, their whispers filling the air. Impossible. The princess lost. To a human. Valessa clenched her jaw. She wanted to silence them all. She was not weak. And yet, as she looked at Daniel, she felt something new. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't rage. It was curiosity. How did he read her moves so easily? How did he counter her speed? No one had ever done that before. Daniel smirked. "You okay, princess?" Vylessa's fingers twitched. The way he said it, it wasn't mocking, but it wasn't respectful either. It was casual, like she was just another opponent, not a royal heiress. She hated it. She loved it. Before she could respond, her royal advisor, Lord Sarek, stepped forward. His face was pale, his voice urgent. "Your Highness, we must not let this embarrassment stand. You cannot allow a human to claim victory over you." Vylessa's eyes narrowed. "Do you think I need advice, Sarek?" The noble stiffened. "Of course not, my princess, but the council will." "The council will do nothing," she interrupted. Her voice was cold, sharp. "I lost. That is all." Daniel chuckled. "Glad we agree." Sarek shot Daniel a look of disgust. "You dare." Vylessa raised a hand, silencing Sarek. Her gaze remained on Daniel. "You are interesting, human," she said slowly. Daniel shrugged. "I get that a lot." A strange heat settled in Vylessa's chest. For the first time in her life, someone had stood against her and won. And he wasn't arrogant about it. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't even trying to claim a reward. He was just being himself. And that was infuriating. "I will learn your secret," Vylessa said under her breath. But Daniel still caught it. He smirked. "Good luck with that." She watched him turn and leave the hall as if nothing had happened. But Vylessa knew the truth. Something had happened. And she wasn't going to rest until she figured out what made this human so different. Princess Vylessa sat alone in her private chamber, staring at the holographic combat footage. Again. For the past 3 days, she had watched the moment of her defeat over and over. Every movement, every counter, every unexpected reaction from the human named Daniel Harker. And yet, no matter how many times she analyzed it, she could not understand. How? She muttered under her breath, frustration boiling inside her. She had fought the finest warriors of her kind. She had trained against the best strategists in the Empire. No one had ever bested her. So why did a mere human, a species physically weaker than her own, manage to defeat her so effortlessly? Her pride told her it was luck. Her instincts told her it was something more. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she said, her voice cold and controlled. The door slid open, revealing Lord Sarek, her most trusted advisor. His reptilian features were tense, his eyes filled with concern. "Your Highness," Sarek began cautiously, "the council grows uneasy." Vylessa raised an eyebrow. "Uneasy?" "The nobles whisper," he continued. "They say your defeat by the human has weakened your position. Some question if you are truly the strongest to lead." Vylessa's fingers curled into fists. Fools. Did they really think a single loss made her weak? Sarek hesitated, then added, "The human must be put in his place." Vylessa's eyes narrowed. "Put in his place?" "Yes," Sarek said eagerly. "You should challenge him again. Humiliate him publicly. Show the court that his victory was nothing but a mistake." Vylessa stood abruptly, making Sarek take a step back. "Do you think I am so pathetic that I must rely on a rematch to prove my strength?" she snapped. Sarek stiffened. "No, princess, but—" "I lost," she said, her voice firm. "I do not need excuses. I need answers." Sarek seemed confused. "Answers?" Vylessa turned away, her mind racing. She had fought warriors. She had fought monsters. But Daniel was neither. He had read her movements. He had reacted before she even attacked. That was not luck. That was skill. "I will deal with the human in my own way," she finally said. Sarek looked displeased but bowed. "As you wish, princess." As he left, Vylessa's gaze drifted to the holographic screen once more. She had never cared about anyone's abilities before. But Daniel, he had changed something in her. And she hated that. With a sharp breath, she turned off the screen. There was only one way to get the answers she wanted. She needed to study the human, watch him, learn him. And then she would prove to herself that he was nothing special. At least, that's what she told herself. Princess Valessa had never followed anyone before. And yet, here she was, standing in the shadows of the palace corridors, watching Daniel Harker from a distance. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. He simply sat in the royal gardens, arms folded behind his head, eyes closed as if he had not a single worry in the universe. It irritated her. For days, she had studied every warrior, every strategist, trying to understand what made Daniel different. But no one could explain it. So, she had decided to observe him herself. Daniel opened one eye, as if sensing her presence. Valessa quickly stepped back behind a pillar. A smirk formed on his lips. "You know, if you want to talk, you don't have to stalk me, princess." Valessa stiffened. She was the ruler of an empire. Why was she acting like a nervous girl? She stepped forward, lifting her chin. "I do not stalk. I observe." Daniel chuckled. "Right, totally different." Valessa's eyes narrowed. "You are far too casual for someone in my presence." He stretched lazily. "Maybe that's because I don't see you as untouchable." Her heart skipped a beat. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Every noble, every warrior, every alien male bowed before her, desperate for her approval. But Daniel, he acted like she was just another person. And for some reason, that unsettled her. She pushed those thoughts aside. "I have questions," she said firmly. Daniel sat up. "And I might have answers." Valessa folded her arms. "How did you defeat me?" He raised an eyebrow. "Really? You've been losing sleep over that?" She glared. "Answer the question." Daniel sighed. "Fine. You relied on speed. Power. The problem? You've always fought people who fear you. They don't think outside the box. I do." Valessa frowned. Thinking outside the box. Before she could question him further, a loud voice interrupted them. "Your Highness." Lord Sarek rushed forward, his expression tense. Behind him, a group of nobles followed, their eyes filled with anger. Valessa turned. "What is the meaning of this?" Sarek bowed. "Princess, the council has spoken. They demand that this human be removed from the palace." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Wow, that's rude." One of the nobles sneered. "The court is uneasy, Your Highness. This human humiliated you. Your leadership is being questioned. If you do not act, some will see it as weakness." Valessa's hands tightened into fists. Weakness. She glanced at Daniel, expecting him to look smug. Instead, he simply shrugged, as if the entire conversation bored him. And that was when she realized something. The nobles feared Daniel not because he was human, but because he had changed the way she saw things. And that made them afraid. Valessa's expression hardened. "The council does not decide who stays in my palace. I do." Sarek's eyes widened. "Princess, this discussion is over," Valessa said coldly. "Leave." The nobles hesitated but obeyed, grumbling as they walked away. When they were gone, Daniel whistled. That was fun. Valessa turned to him. "This is not a game." Daniel smirked. "Maybe not to you." She hated that smirk. She hated that she found it interesting. But most of all, she hated that the council was right. Daniel was changing something in her, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. Princess Valessa sat in her chamber, staring at the shimmering patterns on her walls. Her royal advisor's warnings echoed in her mind. The court is losing faith in you. She hated admitting it, but the council had a point. Her position as heir to the throne had never been questioned. Until now. And it was all because of one human. Valessa exhaled sharply and rose from her seat. She could feel the weight of the empire pressing down on her. She couldn't let herself look weak. She couldn't let others see that the defeat had shaken her. But even as she told herself this, she knew the truth. Daniel Harker wasn't just a human who had bested her. He was a reminder of something Vilessa never wanted to face, the possibility that she wasn't invincible. She needed his help, but asking for it, that would be the hardest challenge of all. Later that evening, Daniel leaned against a stone pillar in the royal garden, gazing up at the twin moons of Xerexia. The cool night breeze ruffled his hair, and for the first time in days, he felt at ease. The palace politics weren't his concern. He was just a visitor, after all. Footsteps approached from behind, and he turned, half expecting another guard ready to escort him away. Instead, he saw Vilessa. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture he hadn't seen before. "What brings you out here, princess?" Daniel asked casually. Vilessa stopped a few paces away, her violet eyes fixed on him. "We need to talk." Daniel folded his arms. "Sure. What's on your mind?" For a moment, she said nothing. This was more difficult than she'd expected. She wasn't used to asking for anything. She was used to commanding. She hesitated. "I require your assistance." Daniel blinked. "My assistance? You mean you need my help?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes." He couldn't help but grin. Wow, that must have been painful to admit. Vilessa's glare was sharp enough to cut steel. "Do not test my patience, human." Okay, he said, holding up his hands. "What do you need?" She took a slow breath. "The council is threatening my position. They claim my defeat weakened my claim to the throne. I need to prove my strength, show them that I can still lead. And you want me to help you. How?" Vilessa's pride screamed at her to stop, but she forced herself to continue. "I need you to stand with me, to show the court that our alliance makes me stronger, not weaker." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Alliance? That's a fancy word for what we have." Her gaze didn't waver. "It's the truth. Will you help me or not?" Daniel studied her for a long moment. The proud, untouchable princess now stood before him, asking, not ordering, for his aid. And for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her. "Fine," he said at last, "but I have some conditions." Vilessa's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "Name them." Daniel smiled. "We'll get to that later. For now, consider me your ally." The word felt strange to her, but she accepted it. She had no choice. In that moment, Vilessa realized just how much Daniel had changed her world, and she wasn't sure she wanted it to go back to the way it was. Princess Vilessa stood in the center of the royal throne room, her sharp violet eyes scanning the assembled nobles. The chamber was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of boots on marble. Tension filled the air. Next to her, Daniel Harker leaned casually against a pillar. He seemed completely unfazed, as if he hadn't just agreed to support the Empire's most infamous ruler. Vilessa's voice rang out, cold and clear. "The Council has questioned my strength, my authority. I will hear their grievances. Now." Lord Sarek stepped forward. He was one of the oldest members of the Council, his reptilian features marked with age and wisdom. Yet today, he looked hesitant, even uneasy. "Your Highness," Sarek began carefully, "the court only wishes to ensure the stability of the Empire. A ruler must remain strong. A ruler must not." He hesitated, glancing at Daniel. "Be seen as vulnerable." Vilessa's eyes narrowed. "And you believe my defeat made me vulnerable?" Sarek bowed his head slightly. "It created doubts, Your Highness." "Doubts that—" "Enough," Vilessa interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a force that made the entire room go silent. She stepped forward. "You speak of doubt. Fine. Let me remove it." Vilessa turned to face the nobles. "For centuries, we have ruled by tradition, by strength of arms alone. But strength comes in many forms. The human standing beside me," she gestured toward Daniel, "bested me not because of brute force, but because of his wit, his resilience, his ability to adapt. These are the qualities of a leader. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting Vilessa take control. You call him a weakness. Vilessa continued. I call him proof that we must evolve. If the council wishes to challenge my claim to the throne, so be it. Step forward. Fight me. Prove that you are stronger. No one moved. Not a single noble dared to take a step. Vilessa stood tall, her expression unyielding, her presence commanding. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again. Daniel watched from the sidelines, arms crossed. He was impressed. This was the Vilessa he had been waiting to see. Finally, Sarek spoke again, his voice subdued. Your Highness, no one here wishes to challenge you. The council withdraws its concerns. Vilessa's gaze lingered on Sarek for a moment. Then she nodded. Good. Then let this matter be settled. The chamber began to empty, nobles filing out quietly, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. As the doors closed behind them, Vilessa turned to Daniel. You could have said something. He shrugged. You didn't need me to. You handled it. A flicker of a smile crossed her lips, though she quickly hid it. Don't get used to that, human. Daniel chuckled. Sure thing, princess. Vilessa strode down the palace corridor, her steps purposeful yet heavy. The confrontation with the council had ended in her favor, but the cost of it lingered in her mind. Her empire was safe, for now. But safety didn't feel like victory. Her thoughts drifted back to Daniel Harker. He had played his part well, standing there, calm, unbothered, as if he knew she would handle everything. He hadn't offered advice, hadn't spoken up. He had let her lead. And somehow, that unsettled her. Vilessa stopped at the balcony overlooking the royal gardens. The twin moons of Zyrexia shone brightly above, their light casting soft shadows on the courtyard below. Daniel was there, of course, sitting on the edge of a fountain, tossing a small pebble from hand to hand. He always seemed to know when she was watching. As if on cue, he looked up and met her gaze. Vilessa hesitated. Part of her wanted to turn back, to leave him in the quiet garden. But another part, one she didn't fully understand, drove her forward. By the time she reached the fountain, Daniel was standing. He folded his arms and tilted his head slightly, that familiar smirk tugging at his lips. You came down here. I'm guessing that means you've made up your mind, he said. Vilessa raised an eyebrow. Made up my mind. Daniel shrugged. About what happens next. About us. She stiffened. What makes you think there is an us? His smirk widened. Call it a hunch. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The faint sound of water trickling from the fountain filled the silence. Finally, Vilessa spoke, her voice quieter than usual. You're different from anyone I've ever met. Good different or bad different? Daniel asked lightly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him at the garden, at the moonlight reflecting on the leaves. You're not like my people. You don't bow to authority, you don't follow tradition, and you don't care about status. That makes you frustrating. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. You don't say. Vilessa's gaze snapped back to his, her tone sharpening. But it also makes you valuable. My court doesn't understand you. They fear what you represent. Change, unpredictability. Yet she hesitated. I respect it. Daniel's expression softened. He leaned back against the edge of the fountain, his posture relaxed. So what now, princess? She looked at him, truly looked at him. Now, I ask you to stay. The words were harder to say than she expected. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Stay. That's not an order. No, Vilessa admitted. It's a request. For a moment, Daniel didn't reply. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that caught her off guard. Well, I guess I can stick around a little longer. Vilessa's lips curved into a rare, small smile. Perhaps she had found her match after all. Princess Vylessa stood before the royal court, her posture firm, her violet eyes steady. The assembled nobles murmured among themselves, watching her every move. Tension crackled in the air. Next to her, Daniel Harker stood in his usual calm, casual stance. His hands were at his sides, his expression relaxed but alert. He wasn't just a human visitor anymore. He was someone who had earned her respect, something she never thought she'd give to an outsider. Vylessa raised her voice, her tone clear and commanding. For too long, our empire has relied solely on tradition and strength. But strength is not enough. To lead, one must be adaptable, resilient, and willing to learn. The nobles listened intently. Some nodded, while others exchanged skeptical glances. It was an unprecedented moment. The princess, who had always been a symbol of unyielding authority, was acknowledging that leadership meant more than just physical dominance. Vylessa glanced at Daniel. This human has taught me that adaptability is not weakness. He has shown me that there is strength in understanding, in strategy, and in challenging the status quo. Daniel's eyebrows raised slightly, but he remained silent, letting Vylessa have the spotlight. The murmurs grew louder. One noble stepped forward, his expression doubtful. "Your Highness, do you mean to say that a human, a visitor from a lesser species, has influenced our way of governance?" Vylessa's gaze hardened. "I mean to say that he has reminded us of what true leadership looks like. It is not about clinging to old traditions. It is about finding what works, what makes us stronger, and what brings us together." The noble hesitated, then stepped back. The room fell quiet once more. Vylessa turned to Daniel. "Daniel Harker, you have challenged me in ways no one else ever has. You have taught me that strength is not measured by power alone, but by resilience, adaptability, and the ability to inspire others." Daniel's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Glad I could help, Princess." Vylessa extended a hand toward him, a gesture that caused audible gasps throughout the chamber. "Will you stand by my side, not as a servant, but as an equal as we lead this empire into a new era?" Daniel looked at her hand, then at her face. Her expression was genuine, her voice steady. This wasn't just a political move. This was a true offer of partnership. He took her hand, shaking it firmly. "Sure, why not?" The room erupted in whispers, but Vylessa didn't care. For the first time, she felt free. Free to lead not as the untouchable princess, but as someone who had learned and grown. As they stood there together, the twin moons of Xerexia casting their light through the chamber windows, Vylessa allowed herself a small, confident smile. This was just the beginning.